In Toronto, on the north side of Gerrard Street, east of the Don River and the Don Valley Parkway, is the Old Don Jail. Some people call it the Dirty Don. John Howard, an English prison reformist born in 1726, said, "I have commonly found prisons situated near a river the cleanest and most healthy." Designed in 1852 by William Thomas, who also designed St. Michael's Cathedral and St. Lawrence Hall, the jail was meant to look intimidating. In 1856, the city of Toronto purchased 119 acres from the Scadding estate to establish a park, hospice, a farm, and a jail for the poor, needy, and disabled. The Don opened in 1864 and was the fourth jail built in Toronto. It replaced the one that was located at Front and Parliament. At the time, it was considered to be a progressive place for housing people who broke the law and was referred to as the Palace for Prisoners. The Palace, with 275 cells that had no electricity, no plumbing, and the prisoners had a bucket as a toilet that was emptied in the mornings. In those days, prisoners were not allowed to talk unless jail staff spoke to them. Prisoners were kept for 23 hours a day in the cell blocks. Exercise galleries were not offered in many jails in those times, but the Palace had one, and prisoners spent 1 hour in constant movement because they weren't allowed to just sit. No basking in the sun at the Palace. Prisoners did maintenance and worked on the farm, harvesting potatoes, carrots, and there were sheep, chickens, and turkeys. The prison farm covered much of what is called Riverdale Farm today. In those days, salmon still ran up the Don River, and prisoners complained of being fed too much of it. Violations for any rules meant prisoners were flogged. On the outside of the building, above the entrance, over the prisoners' heads as they were walked in, was a hand-carved face of Father Time to remind them of their judgment. The only room in the building that was heated was the jail governor's room, where he and his family would live. Later, a house was built across from the jail. More recently, it's where the jail guards would go for their lunch break, and inmates called it the dollhouse. In the early days, prisoners were stripped of their clothes, hosed off, and covered in delousing powder before being given prison uniforms. Based on the other jails at the time, the Palace was considered to be more humane. The jail was overrun with rats, mice, cockroaches, and at its biggest capacity, there were almost 700 prisoners being housed in a jail meant for 1/3 of that amount. The cells were small, 3 meters tall, 2.5 meters deep, and 1 meter wide. When the overcrowding started, men would sleep in hammocks, one on top of the other in the cells. There was even 2 cells with a hole between them that children could crawl through. If their father couldn't pay a debt, the whole family was locked there, and children could go between the mother and the father's cell. The Palace was a dungeon. Sometimes people say things that aren't true at all and are actually a contradiction. At the Don, the mornings smelt like shit and BO, and it was always a violent place. A fight could start from anything, like you didn't brush your teeth, or you can't say a word like come. A day in the Don was worth 2 days in other jails. This happened for 2 decades until Prime Minister Stephen Harper's tough on crime agenda ended it. With 34 executions, 70 murders, and 15 skeletons found under the exercise yard in a place that houses some of the most cruelest or most wronged people in society, there has to be some bad energies here. The most well-known ghost is a blonde woman who was at the Don when the jail didn't only house men. She is described as being angry and had hung herself in her cell in the West Wing in the 1890s. Guards on the graveyard shift reported seeing her floating through the air in the rotunda. The rotunda was where prisoners who violated rules would be flogged while the other inmates watched. It was also where a prisoner swan dove off the highest level to his death. The same rotunda where they filmed a bar scene in the movie Cocktail with Tom Cruise. That's creepy, right? Such contradictions. In 2005, after inmates were locked in their cells for the night, one inmate called to a guard that someone was hitting the punching bag and making too much noise. The guard checked and no one was there. The guard didn't hear or see anything and probably told the prisoner, "Shut up and go to sleep," or whatever it is the jail guards say. But the guards did a prisoner count, and again the sound of the bag being hit and the chains it hung on being rattled. And this time the guards heard it and saw the bag swinging back and forth with no one there. The Don was the last place in Canada anyone was executed, and it was two men at the same time in December 1962. Robert Turpin was 29, who shot and killed a police officer after a robbery, and Arthur Lucas was 54 and convicted of murdering two witnesses of a drug trial. These two men reportedly haunt courtroom 33 in Old City Hall. Robert Turpin grew up in foster homes and reform institutions from the age of 7. After he robbed $632 from the Red Rooster Inn on Danforth Avenue, a traffic cop pulled him over for a broken tail light. Both Robert and the cop, Frederick Nash, shot at each other, and Robert takes off in the police car. The policeman's last words were reported to be, "He shot me first." Arthur Lucas, originally from Georgia and living in Detroit, had been convicted of killing Thurland Crater, a drug dealer and police informant. He was assumed to have killed Thurland's common-law wife, but wasn't tried for her murder. The defender for both cases, Ross McKay, believed Lucas and Turpin didn't deserve to be executed. Robert Turpin didn't deny shooting Officer Nash, but Arthur Lucas maintained his innocence until the end. The details of his case seem like Arthur could have been framed. Police said that on November 16, 1961, Arthur went to Toronto from Detroit and stayed at the Waverly Hotel next to the Silver Dollar on Spadina Avenue. They said Arthur phoned Thurland Crater, an associate from Detroit, staying in the annex. Thurland was a small-time drug dealer pimp and police informer against a kingpin, Gus Saunders. Thurland was the police witness at his drug trial. Court records report that Arthur went to Thurland's place at 3 a.m., made a call to Detroit, then he went back to the hotel and checked out shortly after. The landlord where Thurland was staying saw legs on the ground through the front window. Thurland was dead in the downstairs hallway, his neck open with a football-shaped wound and shot 4 times. They called it overkill. His wife, Carolyn Ann Newman, was upstairs with her throat cut and nearly decapitated. A ring of Arthur's lay in a pool of her blood, and police found a discarded revolver on the Burlington Skyway that police said matched bullets in Thurland's body. By the time Arthur got home, police were waiting for him. Seems a little suspicious, doesn't it? With a crowd outside the Dawn late at night, Robert Turpin and Arthur Lucas are handcuffed behind their backs and walked 40 paces from the death row cells to the gallows. The gallows door that had to be opened with a wrench was already open. 4 guards, the prison governor, and the sheriff accompanied them. The executioner walked in through his door at the back of the gallows wearing a black suit, black bow tie, a white shirt, and black shoes. In a 1976 CBC interview, the executioner, wearing a black hood with 2 eye holes, explains he doesn't wear the hood when he hangs people. He said, "I'm not there to frighten him. I'm there to execute him." Earlier on their last day on Earth, Robert and Arthur ate steak soft enough to cut with a spoon and spoke with the chaplain they had become familiar with, who would read Psalm 23. He told the two men that when he read, "My eyes have seen thy salvation," the trap door would be opened and they would drop with the nooses around their necks. They had been told, "If it's any consolation to you, you may be the last men to hang in Canada." Robert Turpin replied, "Some consolation." The executioner John Ellis said hanging is the most humane form of execution. Isn't that something? Another contradiction. The executioner tightens a strap below the men's knees. He explained it so they couldn't straddle the trap if they're an energetic type. The York County Sheriff Phil Ambrose said condemned men die at least 4 times. The first time is when he's apprehended. The second time is when they receive a guilty verdict. The third time is losing an appeal. And the fourth time is when commutation is refused. The two men are positioned back to back. Cloth hoods slipped over their heads and nooses put on their necks. Arthur had requested his favorite Psalm 35 be read before being hanged. "Let them be ashamed and brought to confusion together that rejoice at mine hurt." But the chaplain chose Psalm 23, and at the words, "mine eyes," John Ellis yanks the lever and the trapdoor opens with a sound that echoes through the jail. The rope snaps the second vertebrae at the base of the skull. The knot digs into the flesh when the rope jerks up. And on that day, something went wrong. The chaplain's son knew something went wrong when his father came home from work with blood splatter on his blue Salvation Army uniform. When the two men dropped, the advanced stages of syphilis made Arthur Lucas's head tear off his body, and blood splattered out of his neck around the gallows. If Arthur had been set up and was an innocent man, it would have been a good revenge. Being hanged is not a humane way to die. The neck is broken, but the heart can beat for 30 minutes or more as the hangman's life slips away, choking to death with a broken neck on the end of a rope. This next story has to be one of, or the most gruesome stories connected to the old Don Jail. The newer part of the Don Jail that had been built in 1977 was emptied in 2013 for the new Bridgepoint Hospital. During the demolition, they found 15 skeletons buried underneath the exercise yard. It's called the Hangman's Graveyard, and the people in there had drowned infants, attacked people to death with hatchets, and murdered police. Only one of the skeletons still had its brain inside their skull. In those days, they removed the brain to study it to see if they could find reasons for the person's criminality. The skull that still had its brain had belonged to Frederick Davis. On August 7th, 1920, the body of 8-year-old Philip Goldberg was found in a vacant lot between 2 billboards near Sunnyside. His throat was slit ear to ear, his skull crushed, and he had been sodomized. It is so chilling that in his hands were clumps of grass and candy wrappers. During the investigation, witnesses said Philip's neighbor, Frederick Davis, had been seen earlier that day with the boy and also walking away from where Philip's body was found. On September 20th, the police released information about a reward for info leading to the arrest of Frederick Davis. He was recognizable from the following police description. It read that he's 43 but looks younger, 5'5", 115 pounds, dark complexion, wears wig, has peculiar lips, 1 gold tooth, was wearing dark blue suit and Panama, is a heavy drinker. There was a reward for $1,000 for information leading to his arrest. The investigation led to an illegal booze ring on McCall Street near present-day OCAD. Frederick Davis was a U.S. citizen, and about a year after the murder, he was located in the U.S. in Auburn State Penitentiary. He was returned to Toronto for the murder of the little boy. The jury took 1 minute to return a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to death, although he had been found to be mentally unstable due to having late-stage syphilis. It was the advanced stages of syphilis that caused sores, which he covered some with a wig, and most likely caused him to have dementia. Frederick Davis perpetrated the brutal rape of a child, but he had also been a victim of childhood sexual abuse. Criminals who were labeled mentally unstable were sent to institutions, but Frederick Davis was hung.
That's kind of weird.
They didn't dissect his brain after death. They probably attributed his crime to the dementia caused by syphilis. Ironically, the one who kept his brain in his head had already lost his mind. Philip Goldberg was buried in Little York Cemetery, and Rabbi Gordon gave the speech at his funeral that was no doubt tragic and heartbreaking. You can think of all the horrors contained within these old walls, but there is something more haunting than the spirits of dead prisoners and child killers hung and buried. It is the knowledge there are a few real-life boogeymen who live inside Toronto jails, and they will do their time, but they won't be kept inside forever. They will return to society and live among the rest of us.